Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right. So we are here today for another episode. It's going to be a little bit different. We are going to be really honing in on our trauma speak. And today's going to be a little bit of trauma around natural disasters with a little bit of grief sprinkled in.
Yeah. We're, Tiffany and I are really excited about this podcast, and those of you who have been listening and engaging with us, it's just been a lot of fun. And so we are really excited to announce that we're going to be focusing this podcast into a trauma podcast. And so a podcast that focuses on different types of trauma, ways of understanding it, working with it, how it impacts us. So we're very excited. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you for everyone who has listened up to this point and helped us, all of our guest speakers, and just all the people who have supported us in this, just because it's been so much fun and life-giving. And also we think that the path to helping the most people and reaching the most people is to focus and moving forward. So thank you so much for those of you who have been subscribed and listening. And I want to really thank you for that, because it's been so encouraging. And also we hope that you find the shift we're going to be making even more helpful with more detailed information.
Yeah, it's gonna be exciting to dive into what we're essentially experts on.
Yeah. And I feel like, I don't know about you, Tiffany, but expert's a big word, but it's that is something I think we both can claim status in, is working with trauma every day and done additional trainings and work. And so we are so excited. So with that announcement that I am giddily smiling about and talking about, we'll dive into the topic for today of just natural disasters. So this is our last episode of grief, but we'll also for sure get into some trauma today. So you just want to take a moment. This may be triggering, so we're just going to throw this trigger warning out that if you have been through a natural disaster, this may not be the podcast for you if you're looking to avoid triggers for that, because we are going to get a very specific today about that. So with that being said, and just giving a moment for folks to hit the pause or zoom out for a second, natural disasters are something that many individuals have experienced, but not everyone knows what to do afterwards. So, and this is not obviously a safety podcast of, this is how you get out of the fire, but just when you're done, right, away, so our nervous system has the fight, flight, flee, feeling safe, feeling exhausted. When we're out of that fight, flight, flee, there's an after portion that comes up, when that adrenaline starts to fade, when we're removed from that stimulus or environment. And so that is more what we have prepped to discuss about today. It's Tiffany, anything you would add?
Yeah, so kind of going out with you said, we're not here to tell you how to survive a natural disaster, just to make that super, super clear. We're really gonna look at the after fact when you there's a lot of adrenaline that's highly involved in natural disasters. There's a lot of flight, and freeze. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of grief. and kind of diving into, you know, what that might look like for you. And then on some ends, some people become really numb and they don't feel anything for a while. Just trying to normalize like all of the emotions and things that can come with that.
So one thing just I think would be interesting to know is just the numbers. So from the emergency event database that there's been in 2022, so we're just going a little bit back, that there were 30,704 lives lost. That would and with those natural disasters, they had 387 in 2022. That's 185 million people impacted in some form or fashion. So we're talking about natural disasters, we're talking about hurricanes, we're talking about, you know, floods, tornadoes, uh, just any event of nature impacting. So, as you can probably imagine, if you are someone who maybe has not gone through an experience, it may be hard to relate to, but I think we can kind of understand. So, just kind of maybe starting with like that aftercare. So, this is just something to say, like, we're not trying to shame you. We all need to start somewhere. But this is kind of just a step-by-step guide. So just kind of the first thing of just noticing like when we're away from those situations, we're starting to heal, we're starting to move on. There may be a sensitivity. For this, just I think it may be more helpful for learning to use a specific example. So Tiffany, I'm going to use the one of Gatlinburg. They unfortunately seem to have very large floods on some kind of basis. Not trying to love Gatlinburg, but seems like I'm seeing a video once a year of really intense floods. So if we would just pretend for a moment that you and I, we got our families together, we go to Gatlinburg, and we witness this, just using that as the example, that if we witness the flood, depending on where we were, there may be some sensitivity. So if the sirens are going off, I may come back to Cincinnati and be really just bothered by the sirens, by the noises that I heard when that was going on. Maybe even like the smell. Um, and again, I don't want to make light of this, but even just like, seeing things soaking wet, seeing water, like, a body of water kind of moving with a little bit of energy versus sitting, like those could all be examples of the triggers. The thing I just want to encourage folks is you can't pick what your triggers are. That would be amazing if we could. Your brain decides that, your nervous system decides that. You as a conscious person do not decide what your triggers are or are going to be. The other frustrating part is that when we're trying to work on our triggers, not any one path works for everyone. So then we have to kind of understand, where do we start from. So as far as environmental pieces and triggers, Tiffany, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, I think something to keep in mind the symptoms of traumatic grief, especially around natural disasters. I have a nice little list of symptoms I want to read off that like you may or may not find yourself engaging in. So there's that preoccupation with the deceased, pain in the same area as the deceased, memories that are upsetting. You avoid reminders of death. Death is unacceptable, feeling life is empty, longing for the person. You may hear the voice of the person who died, drawn to places and things associated with the deceased. You may see the person who died. There's anger about the death. You feel it's unfair to live when this person has died. Disbelief about the death. You're bitter about the death. You're feeling stunned or dazed. You're envious of others who may have made it out. You have difficulty trusting others. You feel lonely, difficulty caring about others because of what happened. Or just to name a few like of the complicated things that can occur when you lose someone traumatically through such a thing.
Brilliant, Tiffany. Brilliantly said. And I think just the other piece I would add is that like it's okay to have those things going on. And maybe the thing I would add, because not everyone knows this, and I think sometimes, Tiffany, I have to remind myself as a therapist and counselor, not everybody knows what we know or like has access to all the things that we have access to. And so in that piece, one of the things that I think we could clearly maybe just try to draw some attention to is the American Red Cross does some very cool things. One of those is psychological first aid training. So, as a graduate student, I got this training that I wasn't licensed, but it was to go out into natural disasters and be there as a supportive person, because so much research shows that even during or just post or just after, that is a very helpful time to process some of the energy of what's happened to us, and can lead to better health outcomes of like, how do we recover, how do we heal. So that's one thing. The next, and why I say that, is it leads into the next thing of finding a local support group. So, if it was a local disaster, finding that space, groups can be very helpful for those who have survived, realizing we're not alone. Um, having support, because I think right now in 2024, a lot of folks are not getting the support they need. They're not having it. They don't know where to build it. They don't know where to get connected. So just having that space. And so groups aren't for everyone, but I would say if they make you uncomfortable, it's probably because you know that will be a stretch, and some stretches are worth taking. So I don't want you to tear your shoulder out of socket, but I would challenge you to stretch your shoulder a bit, be in that space to heal, and know that the group is there for everyone.
I love that the way you describe that metaphor of stretching. It's a beautiful way to put how you want to build your mental health resilience is the same way you'd want to build your flexibility. You're not going to instantly right out of the gate do the splits. You have to slowly build up that flexibility and work those muscles to gain the strength to be able to do that. And keeping in mind that it's okay, that it takes time and it's a step-by-step process to build that mental strength, to like test yourself and to stretch out those uncomfortable interactions and challenges that you may or may not have to face.
I love that. And so one of the things that I think, I almost think soon in the next year, Tiffany, there'll be a new word for self-care, because people have such a negative reaction to it, and not in the decadence, but I think because it's such a buzzword that we don't know what it means. It's almost like mental health, self-care. Like, what does that mean? But finding ways of like, we're just going to use different words, healthy behaviors. So healthy behaviors to let out some of that extra stress. So that could be a lot of things, but eating balanced meals, giving rest, finding some relaxation techniques. One of the things that's very common, right? We're like, oh wow, it's been really stressful, really stressful. So just remembering to try not to self-medicate. Like, I have no judgment on substances. Substances are a part of life, but just being very mindful of that, because that can be a very feeling justified in doing, but that may just not be the door you want to open to manage the stress, and just being mindful of that. And for my folks in recovery, just being mindful that that's a very common temptation, not to judge ourselves or shame ourselves, but that may be a great time to do the program you've been working, check in with your sponsor, check in with your therapist, check in with your support system, and not wait. So kind of not waiting for it to get all of those things going on. Tiffany, anything you would add?
Yeah, something to add to that is in terms of like allowing yourself to be okay and like making sure you're taking care of yourself. Making sure that you guys are aware of some of the complications that can arise from traumatic grief. Like prolonged grief or traumatic grief can produce the onset or reoccurrence of depression or a major depressive disorder. It can also cause an onset or reoccurrence of a panic disorder or other anxiety disorders. It possibly can increase your vulnerability to PTSD symptoms. It can also increase your desire to use unhealthy coping mechanisms such as substances, smoking, unhealthy relationships with nutrition, and things of that nature. It can also increase suicidal ideation. And even on another level, it can onset the worsening of health issues that you may or may not have, because your body has to figure out what it's going to do with all that trauma that it's housing.
Absolutely. I think just with that kind of having awareness, avoiding making major life decisions, you're not going to be viewing things in the same way, which, you get to make your own decisions as an adult person, but just really understanding that, like, in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster is not the time to think about like switching career jobs or relationship. Am I saying you can't make changes after that? No, you certainly can make changes. but maybe just giving some time to settle down, and maybe recover slightly from just some of that, or maybe get through a few waves of some of that energy
Mhm.
before going into the
Yeah.
next thing.
Something too that I found really surprising about some of the risk factors that were identified with complications and bereavement around traumatic natural disasters was socioeconomic status. You, how does that hit you?
Mm. Can you say, yeah, well, it seems really interesting. Can you say more about that for economic status impacting
Yeah.
trauma?
So lower socioeconomic status is related to poor health status in general. Bereavement appears to affect people similarly, regardless of that socioeconomic status, though. Um, Bereavement appears to be somewhat more stressful for younger individuals than it is for older individuals when you have a lower socioeconomic status because you're so focused on meeting your basic needs that this is just another stressor that is taking up mental space that you may or may not have the capacity to manage when you're focused on like just basic needs kind of things.
Mm. It that does make sense. I think also just the ability to like take time off,
Mhm.
right? Or like, do the extra things or do some of the things that one would need to heal or recover or budget in and having margins. So it doesn't surprise me you finding that statistic and knowing it's valid with just all of the other health outcomes that are linked to economic status. It's really troubling. Don't want to discourage everyone, but it's very troubling to look at health outcomes and life expectancy and pretty much any outcome and look at like economic status and looking like if there was that chart of economic status and then the chart of recovery, or it's very troubling. So this is a shout out to all the public health folks out there doing some great work to change some of those things and advocacy and all those things because it's very needed.
Yeah.
So one other thing I would maybe just throw out there is just being honest about the symptoms that you're having. So really just being honest about this is what's happening. I haven't been sleeping like this, or I'm having trouble with this image, this or that. Like not feeling shame, but really being honest. Like you're not being dramatic, you're not being attention. Like you just need to be honest about what's going on. Sometimes as a therapist, folks feel the need to kind of bring a really cleaned house to us when maybe the reality is it's not a disaster, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the house. Like maybe just something not done that needs done. Like, hey, this wall is gonna fall over if we don't fix it, versus you putting a curtain up and saying, oh, it's fine. Like it's okay that the wall's like that. We can't really fix that wall if we're not going to go into it. And so it doesn't make you a bad person, deficient, or anything like that. It just means we need to take time for ourselves and time to notice things.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a few, just as we're kind of winding down here a bit, a few more risk factors for grief. So, in one of the other episodes we've done on grief, we talked about complicated versus uncomplicated grief. So, uncomplicated grief is like, maybe your childhood dog died. I mean, I'm not in the sense that it's not going to be complicated and hard, but that's just, hey, you know what? That my dog's going to get old, that's going to happen. Or my grandparents lived to be 100, lived a full life, and one left the earth peacefully. That would be, I think, examples of uncomplicated. But complicated grief is when we start having lots of interactions going on. And so I maybe just read a few of those. The person who maybe passes away or dies is a child. Other life stressors going on. So like Tiffany is maybe saying, like having low economic status is definitely a life stressor that impacts things. Um, if we're talking about the relationship with the person or the situation. So maybe like if we use Gatlinburg, maybe you don't like Gatlinburg and you wanted to leave. So then your house is gone and you're like, now you feel bad. I don't know. Like I'm just not to go too far with this, but just that could maybe change some things. The other thing that's a risk factor for complicated grief is your ability to cope with stress and how susceptible we are to stress. We all have a certain level of susceptibility to stress, but some of us are maybe more at risk than others. Lack of social support would be a challenge for a risk factor for complicated grief. And the other is a history of mental illness and substance use. Does that mean that if you have one of those things, you're for sure going to be in complicated grief? No. But it does mean you have more of a risk factor. Just like, diabetes runs in my family, so I can't only eat sugar, or else I am probably playing with fire. So that's what we kind of talk about a bit when we're looking at some of the things for risk factors.
Yeah.
And that is what I mostly have for grief today. Tiffany, is there anything else you would add for grief on natural disasters?
I think the kind of last tidbit that I want to add is I want to caution people against using casual or passive attitudes towards individuals who went through a natural disaster. And that can be an example of those statements is call me if you want to talk, or how are you doing? Um, it's not a casual loss. It's not something that we experience on an everyday basis. So treating it as such can be very off-putting, and hard for individuals to want to open up and like be with that when we dismiss the reality of how unnatural, uncasual a natural disaster really is. And not to make statements about death that in any way is quote unquote acceptable, such as like he or she is in a better place, or it is God's will. Not to like bash on anyone's religion, but those statements are really unhelpful when you're looking at something that such as a natural disaster, when someone's brain is trying to like make sense of something that just doesn't make sense in that time and space.
Yeah, people really need to think through what they're gonna say,
Hmm.
because sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but I'm like, it's like if that's such a horrible thing to say, like, yeah, yeah. We should all be mindful of what we're saying to people and not saying to people, with whatever they're going through, but specifically when could it be funny? I mean, they literally in insurance term, they have the term act of God. So it's like, I think there's just this rooted thing of like, oh, God does stuff like that. So then if you say, oh, it's God's will, it's like, well, what is you? It was God's will for insert thing. It's like, you gotta be really careful
Hmm.
about. And I'm saying this as a person that's like grew up in the church, goes to church. Like that's just, you should not say something like that to someone, because there are some things that are absolutely horrible, and would not think that that is helpful. That someone thinks their higher power is sanctioning what's happening to them. That's not a helpful thing, in my opinion. Hot take as we're winding out, but I don't think that's helpful. I don't know anyone that's been helpful for.
Yeah. Another thing is don't make the assumption that that person is strong, slash willpowered enough slash should get through this on their own. Like a natural disaster is catastrophic. No one should have to experience such a thing, but some people do, and it's just unfair to assume that everyone has the same um, mental capacity to just like pull up their pants and move on. Like people are going to need time, people are going to need love and support, and being able to recognize that. And then also the avoidance of discussion of death of the person um, should only be respected if the person asks you to avoid the convert. Like if the person that
Mhm.
lost the person says, I don't want to talk about it, then you should for sure respect that. But if you in general are avoiding talking about what happened, you're creating an awkward void for that person not to feel safe to with you to process through that loss of a person when you might be the only person they trust to do that. So just being aware of like it's okay to talk about that loss of an individual, unless that person has asked you specifically, like, I'm not ready to talk about this, or I don't want to talk about so and so right now. Just be very mindful of what an individual is asking you and how they're asking you to support them.
Well said. Well said, Tiffany.
Yeah, so that's kind of my like words of caution when trying to support someone who's going through something like a natural disaster that can be so hard for our minds to rationalize because it doesn't make sense as to why it would really happen to us.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.